Okay, so I guess this is a new segment for the show. We're going to talk about, I don't have a name for it yet, but we're going to talk about a book that you have reviewed or are going to review. So, socialist book reviews.
Yeah. Left review, read left review. I don't know, something like that. Something along those lines. Yeah. But yeah, I'm Justin Clark. I'm a public historian. I live in Indiana here in the U.S. And I'm also the political education co-chair for Central Indiana DSA. And so one of the things that's really important to me in my life is books, as if you couldn't tell from behind me. I think every other couple of weeks, you and I will meet and talk for a little bit about a book that I've read. Yep. Some of these will be more positive and sort of like fun, and some of them will be more kind of, I think, critical. So like this one tonight's going to be like really fun and like light and interesting.
A good first one.
The good first one, very positive first one. And then the next one's going to be the one where you watch me rip a book a new asshole. So that's that's going to be. I actually just finished the written version of that review. That's up on my blog. For those who are interested in the next time we meet, we'll be talking about Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell. And I did sort of a retrospective review of that because the book turned 15. So I was sort of looking back as did his central claims hold up? Spoiler alert, they didn't. And so that's kind of what we'll be doing next time. But tonight, we're going to be doing a much more fun read, something that's way more in my wheelhouse, which is this awesome novel. We're starting with a novel called The Ministry for the Future. And this is by the legendary science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson. Robinson is probably best known for the Mars trilogy, which he wrote in the 90s. One of the things about Robinson that's really cool is he takes two things that I really love and kind of puts them together. One of them is science fiction, which I'm a huge science fiction guy. I love science fiction. I'm a big Star Trek fan. I love Philip K. Dick's books. I love Ray Bradbury and Kim Stanley Robinson does a lot of what we call hard sci-fi, where he's sort of keeping up with the latest science and then using some of the latest science to extrapolate a sort of plausible version of something. So, for example, in the Mars trilogy, he uses the most updated science at the time, which in the early 90s, to basically plot out like what would a human mission to Mars actually be like. Now, many science fiction authors had done this in the past. Most notably people like Robert Heinlein or Arthur C. Clarke. But what Robinson does is he sort of lays out like what it would take to get there. And over the series of 3 books, he not only plots out like the science of what's going on, but it also pairs with the other component of his work that I really love, which is politics. He's a radical socialist and he's a member of the DSA. He has been a socialist for many, many, many years. And so he always pairs his science fiction work with a sense of radical politics. And The Ministry for the Future is definitely one of those. The other thing that's interesting about him in the last probably 10 or so years of his work, I mean, it's always been a major component of his work, but over the last 10, 15 years has been his emphasis on talking about climate change. And The Ministry for the Future is all about climate change. Basically, it's what he describes as the best case scenario over the next 2 to 3 decades of what could happen with climate change.
If we address climate change and
yes, if we actually address it, if there's like a political movement behind it where things start to move. And so he posits a lot of different kind of scenarios in the book and some different technologies we can kind of get into. But the central thrust about his writing that I really love is it has this sort of humanist streak through it. So he's writing realistically, but he's also writing optimistically in the sense that he's sort of saying, like, if we do these things, this is how this might work out. And ultimately, he definitely believes that humans are capable of solving our own problems, which is something that I find very rewarding, not just as a writer, but just as a person, that I think that it's important for us to get beyond this idea that we can't solve our own problems. I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in politics and a lot of it, and especially I think on the left, what I think he does is he sort of reinvigorates that optimistic spirit, because that's what we're supposed to be. And I think this is something we talked about the last time we chatted.
Right.
And so that's kind of a kind of an overview of kind of what it is. So it's this kind of sprawling epic that has a lot of politics, it has a lot of science, and it has a lot of like sort of human moments scattered throughout. And there's sort of two main characters, and we can kind of talk about those. But I don't know if this is a question and answer thing. I'm not sure how you want to set this up.
I mean, so far you've answered everything that I've thought of as we're going.
Okay.
Yeah, like if you like, I was just about going to ask, is it like through the eyes of a particular character?
Yeah, so it's through the eyes. I would say there's probably two main characters in the book. There are many other sort of ancillary characters, but there's really two.
Okay.
So one of them is the first character you meet. It's a guy named Frank May. And the book opens with a massive catastrophic event in India where there's a massive heat wave that leads to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay.
And he's one of the survivors. So the book opens with this story of him basically wading out into, I'm not sure if it's the Ganges River or not, but some kind of body of water. And he's basically like, it cools it down enough so that he can survive the night. And when he wakes up, he's just surrounded by corpses.
Oh, geez.
In the water. And so the book kind of follows his life for the next 20, 30 years. And so it radicalizes him. And his character arc eventually kind of collides with the other major character in the novel, which is a woman named Mary Murphy.
Okay.
And Mary is, I think, from Scotland or Ireland. I think she's from Ireland. And she's the head of what's called the Ministry for the Future. So in the book, what the Ministry for the Future is it's like this enforcement arm of the Paris Climate Accord. So imagine a future where the Paris Climate Agreement actually has some kind of teeth to it. And there's an actual enforcement arm that basically creates policy. And that's what she heads. And she meets Frank because at one point he basically kidnaps her. So he sort of radicalizes because of his experiences. He suffers from PTSD. And he joins this sort of radical outfit called the Children of Kali, which is kind of like an ISIS or like a Al-Qaeda kind of thing.
Okay.
And he sort of does it tangentially because like the Children of Kali are like, he's not really ours. Like he's kind of a one-off guy doing his own thing. Like we do organized work. He's not, and he's also white. Right. So like, it's like the whole insider outsider thing, which I think is important to note that like, he's kind of like, I'm going to speak for you, but he basically kidnaps Mary in her apartment. And instead of him like hurting her or like killing her or anything like that, they end up having this conversation. And basically he's saying, your people are not doing enough. You're not doing enough. You fancy ass people, because the Ministry for the Future is, it's stationed in Switzerland. And so he's like, you fancy ass people, you're in Switzerland. You're just twiddling your thumbs. I've experienced how bad this is. When are you going to do something? Right. And this is a very sort of cathartic moment for Mary. So instead of her sort of reacting how we would imagine most sort of government bureaucrats as, she has a certain level of empathy for him. And she recognizes like, oh my God, this man's life has been ruined by the very thing we're trying to solve. And so the book kind of follows their lives as they interact with one another. So when he gets caught, as he eventually does, right, he goes to prison. Well, prison in Switzerland is like nothing, right?
It's not bad.
it's nothing, right? Like it's basically like a nice little like resort, Right. But he starts to be a volunteer in a refugee camp. So one of the central themes of the book is climate refugees and how that's going to be a real world issue that we're going to have to solve. And so he becomes close with a refugee family. And he sort of raises this woman's daughter as his own, and they're sort of close. And this is all the while. So this is kind of the very human, personal stuff of the book. And then the other stuff in the book is like the political stuff, where Mary Murphy's like meeting with governments, and she's developing like different avenues of how we can solve the problem. So there's different concepts in the book that could be kind of real world examples of what we could do. Okay. One of them is that Robinson talks about is the idea of a carbon coin. So imagine a universal currency that would have the kind of weight like the US dollar or say the Chinese renminbi or yuan, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically that you tie the value of this coin to keeping fossil fuels in the ground.
Okay.
And so the more that you sequester and just keep oil or natural gas in the ground, the more carbon coin you get and the more value it actually has. And so governments around the world sort of organize around this carbon coin concept, and they give it the sort of institutional weight that it would need, right? And what ultimately happens is a lot of companies basically just get out of the oil business. And so there's this kind of very optimistic moment where the oil companies basically retool and they start sort of retrofitting their facilities to instead of moving oil, they move water, which is another component of the book, which is there's an interesting side plot of the book, which is why you see this like giant tunnel on the cover.
Okay.
Is that one of the technologies that Robinson explores in the book is the idea of basically terraforming glaciers at the Arctic poles. So one of the ways that we could keep glaciers is actually boring into them and then basically creating a pressure valve where water shoots back through that's melted and refreezes. Right. So that it so basically cycles through and continually recharges the glacier so that it doesn't fully melt and that the water levels don't rise. And this is all based on real science. This is all theoretical stuff that people are sort of working through.
Right.
Which is very, very interesting. The other thing that's interesting about his book, and the cover also kind of gives it away, is you might notice on the cover there's a Zeppelin.
Okay.
Those become a thing again. And those are because they're easier to run and they're sort of run on, I think, solar panels or something.
Right. As opposed to fossil fuels. So there's a lot of so for like the wonky, nerdy Vox crowd, there's enough of that shit in this book to get them excited. Right. And then for like sci-fi nerds like me, there's enough to get you excited. If you're interested in following the human characters, there's enough to get you excited. And then if you're a radical, you're sort of a left radical, there's a lot in the book to get you excited. Like basically India goes communist. Okay.
So because of the horrible heat wave, the BJP, which is the current government, the current party that rules India today under Modi, the sort of far right nationalist, some would say proto-fascist party, is kicked out. They're absolutely destroyed. And there's a left coalition that is developed, which is led by the Indian Communist Party, which for a lot of people who know in the real world, in our world, the Indian Communist Party is actually one of the strongest communist or left parties in the world. It basically runs the state of Kerala in India. And one of the things that they institute is more sort of restorative agriculture. So they move away more from the sort of big ag elements that would lead to sort of environmental destruction. And they go back to more sort of traditional methods of agriculture. So it's a mix of like cutting edge science with like traditional methods, right? Okay. Because one of the ways that we often talk about this discussion in our lives is that like it's either sort of ancient wisdom versus science or technology. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I think what Robinson tries to show is that like there are traditions that are worth saving from the past that are worthwhile mixed with good cutting edge science. And that's kind of what it is. There's a resurgence of Sovietism in Russia. So Russia's kind of moving away from being the sort of autocratic pseudo-feudalism that it is today back, more to sort of the best version of like Soviet Bolshevism of sort of Lenin's era. So that's another component of the book. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but we can get into that. I know I've kind of gone off your original question, but yeah, but that's kind of, and like I said, it's truly a sprawling book. I mean, it's a book that covers like 4 decades. It takes place all over the world. And the book is like, kind of has non-linear storytelling where it kind of jumps around a lot. And within the main narrative of the book, there's these like 2 or 3 page chapters where he just explains things. Like, so he explains like what ideology is, or he explains like what neoliberalism is. And he kind of explains sort of what's going on as the book goes through.
That's interesting. Like, I guess you sort of, as you were explaining it, I was thinking, well, where does the radical politics come into this? So that's really neat.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I haven't even talked about one of the more interesting parts of the book, which is that there's basically a dark wing of the Ministry for the Future.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So Mary has a partner that she sort of works with in the ministry that has, you know, for those who are fans of Star Trek, they basically have their own version of Section 31. And Section 31 will do the dark work that no one else is willing to do. And this is sort of inspired by her encounter with Frank, who kidnaps her. Like, he's like, you're not doing enough. You need to push it. You need more. And so what this sort of radical wing does, and it's never clear exactly what they do.
Right.
But it's sort of implied that basically they essentially put pressure on fossil fuel executives to basically give up. Because if not, we'll make your life a living hell.
Right.
And then throughout the book, like, just mysterious deaths happen where, like, you know, like some oil executive will end up dead, or
and nobody says that it's them. But.
Yeah. Or some billionaire philanthropist ends up dead, that kind of thing. And I think that's kind of interesting. And so, you know, what he's essentially advocating for in the book is like moving away from the sort of neoliberal model to truly a planned economy. He throughout the book, he sort of advocates, like, there's this conversation Mary has with some of these monetary people where she has to convince them to like be on board with the carbon coin, and which is arguably not particularly a socialistic idea, but it's one that sort of gets the ball rolling in terms of incentive structures.
Right.
Because that's the thing that's important for Robinson, is like he's thinking about things through in real time. Like, okay, like what would this be like 10 years from now? Like, we're going to still live with much of what we were living through in capitalism. So how can we shape capitalism to be better and get us onto the road to socialism? Right. And then at some point in the book, he basically just lays out like the only way we're going to do this is through planning. The only way this is going to work is through planning and through essentially socialism. And that's what was laid out later in the book. And that's, in many ways, that is exactly what happens. You have, you know, massive investments in public infrastructure, part of which is the sort of the polar ice caps or glacial restoration work. And then you see political transformations. So basically governments start becoming more objectively left wing, whether it's in India or Russia or Latin America, and then even to some extent the United States. I mean, that's like my only criticism of the book, is that it seems like there's never a scene where like you see the president of the United States talking to someone. Like, that doesn't happen.
Okay.
Or like the American thing is like, he almost sort of assumes that Americans are going to fuck this up. So he sort of, and so he kind of, he sort of definitely has like sort of internationalist perspective where he thinks like the people who are really going to do this are like China and India, and like those are the people who are going to do this more. So that's kind of where the radical stuff comes in. Okay,
no, that's interesting. I don't know how have you read anything on the science of this rejuvenation of the glaciers? Like that's really interesting to me, but I'm not sure. Like, it would be so complicated to figure out.
Yeah. Only sort of what I remember, Robinson did a Q&A with DSA, I think a month or two ago, where he outlined a little bit of it, where he was getting it mostly through newspaper articles. So I read a little bit of that. And it is fairly theoretical, but they're sort of trying to figure out some of the rudimentary stages of how that would work. And so I think it's a science that like would require massive public investment in to really get off the ground.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I haven't looked into it as much as I maybe should have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
tell you.
I'm just curious. It sounds really interesting.
It's one of the, I think scientifically, it's the most interesting concept of the book. I mean, it's this like idea of like essentially terraforming, and it's sort of a baseline version of terraforming, which is kind of interesting because that's going to be the long-term problem.
Yeah.
Is that as the glaciers and the polar ice caps melt, you're going to have two problems, which is one, you're going to have the acidification of the oceans, which is already beginning. And then 2,
Yeah.
you're going to have basically local climate cycles being completely messed up because the polar ice caps no longer exist. So there's, so cities are going to disappear, wildlife's going to disappear. And so, essentially the book is optimistic, but it also lays out that like, this is going to suck, but this version of it sucks less than what would happen if we do nothing, because essentially right now we're doing nothing.
Yeah.
And and I think, more than any other book, this book has really underscored the importance of climate change to me, because for many years, like I was kind of like, whatever. And especially when I had like garbage politics, when I was more of like the Steven Pinker bent, I just said, we'll solve that, move on. Who cares? Like,
right. Science will do something eventually.
Science will do something eventually, whatever. But what Robinson, and I think what makes him overtly political and radical, and I think on the political left, is that he says like the way for us to actually move the needle on the science is through direct public investment. It's going to require governments to coordinate and work together to do this. And more importantly, it's going to take a revitalization of democracy to do this. And so that's where I think a lot of the radical elements of the book come from. It's very interesting. He's a guy who gets a lot of praise from both, people like me, Marxists or socialists, but also people of the sort of nerdy, boxy crowd I talked about earlier kind of like him, because he kind of goes into the details of like, okay, well, what would this actually look like? And so, the other thing is like, there are other interesting technologies that are more radical. He talks about the reinvigoration of public banking. He talks about how there's something called Your Lock, which is basically a Facebook, but that you own, and you own your own data and then can sell it to someone if you want and make money off of it. So like there's that, and in the book, Your Lock become a central point of communications between people. It's basically, and it's owned by the government. So like it's democratically owned by the people and the government respectively. So imagine like a WhatsApp, but nationalized. Like that's kind of what it is.
Right.
And so the book kind of hints at the idea that like, we're going to shut Facebook down and replace it with this, which I think is great. Like I think the idea of shutting down Facebook and replacing it with like a public alternative that's owned by the public, I think is a really cool idea.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's little just stuff throughout the book that's kind of like that. So it's a book that hinges on details, but also has the big picture too.
That's awesome. So is there anything you want to mention before we consider this book review finished? Yeah,
sure. So basically, I won't give away much of the ending. The book, I will say, doesn't have like antagonists in like the normal sense. Like it doesn't have like a big baddie that like you have to hate.
Climate change is the baddie.
Climate change is the baddie.
Right.
So like, there are famines, there are, horrible weather events, there are mass deaths, like there's all kinds of horrible shit going on. But ultimately the book is a book of hope. And I think for those on the left, I think one of the things that I think is important about the book, and whether you think he goes far enough is a whole other question, but like basically what he's saying is we need to start thinking about what it would look like if we actually started to do this. That we, it's not enough to just say like the oil companies are bad and we should like go away from fossil fuels. Like that's a part of it, right? But that's only a part of the equation. Like you have to think about, industrial agriculture. You have to think about, ecosystems. You have to think about glaciation. All those different components are important. So he thinks through them, and ultimately, it's a book where humanity kind of succeeds, and which I think is kind of lovely.
Sounds good.
In an era where apocalyptic visions are something that are pretty normal, it's just kind of nice to have something that isn't. So,
no kidding.
I highly recommend it. I think it's a great read. It's a quick read for short chapters. It zips by pretty quickly. I couldn't recommend it more. I think it's the book for people to read about like a possible future, a good future about climate change.
Cool. No, that sounds good.
Great.
Is there, as we were just talking here, I was thinking, do you want to do like a kind of rating system?
Yeah, we can do that. So, we can sort of match it to my Goodreads review. I'm pretty generous with my
Sure.
reviews, especially like if I like the book. So I think I gave this like a 5 out of 5 stars, you know. If I was going to be more
Sure.
discerning, I would maybe give it like a 4 or 4.5. Sort of, you know, with my criticisms, my main criticism of the book being that like the United States is like a component, but it's not as big a component. I feel like that's something that needs to be said. So that would be kind of my other quibble. And then just on a narrative level, it's a book that does jump around a lot. And if you can figure out like his syntax or like sometimes he's very direct as a writer. Sometimes he's very poetic. Sometimes he's very metaphorical. Sometimes he's very literal. Like it's all over the place. So it's not like a very simple, it's easy to read because it's quick, but it's not like, it doesn't move the way a traditional novel would in that kind of sense, because it's jumping all around. So if that's something that might be difficult for you, then I just kind of let you know for that. So yeah, I would say, you know, 4.5 stars, something like that out of 5.
It's not a perfect book, but it's very, very good.
It's damn near perfect. I mean, it's pretty great. I mean, you know, I will certainly be able to give you a better star rating for the next book we do. But yeah, so I highly recommend it. People check it out. It's eco-socialism. I'm getting more and more into that kind of reading, so it's good stuff.
Yeah. No, sounds good. Well, I guess thank you for your review of this. What was the book again? Title?
The book is called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. We'll
find our local socialist bookstore so you can find it.
Yeah, it's published by Orbit Books. You can probably get it directly through them.
Yeah, probably.
If you want to avoid giving Bezos money, you might be able to get it through Red Emma's, the cooperative bookstore in Maryland.
Definitely worth checking out.
And give it a read for sure.
Awesome.
And if you don't mind, I just figured I'd do a little bit of plugs if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
All right. So if you're interested in learning more about the DSA, I highly recommend people check out if you're in the States. I'm a member of Central Indiana DSA. I'm a part of the leadership. So, you know, if you're in the Indiana area, you're interested in learning about DSA, you know, you can always reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at Justin Clark PH for public history. And you can always reach out to me there. That's where I do this sort of formal book reviews and other things like that. And you can also check out everything about me on my website, justinclark.org, which I promise you I didn't pick to be pretentious. It's just .com was taken and .net seemed cheap. So I went with .org.
Yeah. Those .coms are always so expensive.
Yeah, they are. They are. And I'm not really selling anything. So yeah. And then I would just say, you know, check out my blog there. I've got a bunch of different articles up there. My latest article is my retrospective review of Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, which we'll cover next time.